Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your boy Preston here, and honestly, this isn't a video of the Seahawks, like I said before, and shit like that. It's actually gonna be a boxing video, and shit like that, and it's gonna be Brian Norman versus Jen Sasaki, and overall, let me see if Jen Sasaki is a champion. Let me see. No, he isn't a champion, but yeah, he isn't the champion, but he's the number two fighter to fighting Jaron Ennis. The number one fighter, the number one mandatory was Alexis Rocha, but obviously I can understand why they picked Jin Sasaki, because I would pick Jin Sasaki over Alexis Rocha in my opinion, and shit like that, but yeah, man, and shit like that, but he is a champion. But yeah, man, it's gonna be, Brian Norman versus Jen Sasaki, man, and shit like that, and overall I do like this is gonna be definitely a pretty good test for Brian Norman, because Jen Sasaki, like first of all, Asian fighters they're known to having pretty good chins, and shit like that. I'm not trying to be racist. If you're trying to say racist, I'm giving y'all credit, and shit like that because like there's nobody that like in boxing that just naturally has a good chin like Asian fighters, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that. And overall, like he knows how to throw punches and he does like utilize a bit of footwork, but he gets hit with every single fucking shot, and stuff like that. And going against Brian Norman, like no matter who you are, like eventually, like it isn't gonna play a good factor on your mental health, and stuff like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, because Brian Norman, he hits hard, and excuse me, but he fought fighters like like Giovanni Santillan, and shit like that. He literally made like literally he made that shit look easy work. Like at first, Santillan had a bit of work because I mean like Santillan is pretty good at fighting in the inside and shit like that, but at the same time and shit like that, Brian Norman still went to work, and no matter, and when you're just coming forward against him and trying to throw hands and shit like that with no defense, like that's not gonna play very good dividends and shit like that, Even though I do feel like Sasaski's a little bit more defensively prone than Giovanni Santillan, and shit like that, because Santillan periodically he just gets impacted from every single hit, like as long as Sasaki can be able to block like some shots, like he could be able to take off some of the impact, from the punches, and shit like that, so that's the thing and stuff like that, but you know yeah, and stuff like that, let me just say save this clip and yeah. Oh shit. But we're just gonna quickly run through what these fighters need to do, and stuff like that, I'll probably also say the record too, and shit like that. If you're watching this fight, and stuff like that, because I'm literally staying up and shit like that, and this fight oh shit. Is at like 1:30, in the morning over here, in the United States, and stuff like that over here in Washington State, and shit like that, but the thing is though that Brian Norman gotta watch out for is that power, bro. Like I've seen people in the comments saying like Norman's gonna be too strong. I mean, they're both gonna be kind of too strong for each other, because Sasaki can punch, and shit like that, and he's quick too, and shit like that, And the one thing that both these fighters kind of do have a problem with is being sometimes a little too patient and and they're in kind of not really too cautious, and shit like that. Sometimes they gotta like worry about. Well, Norman's more cautious, but sometimes you can see that he's not very cautious. But I'm just saying this is what Norman gotta watch out for is this power, because literally 19 wins with 17 knockouts. That's the thing and shit like that. It's like, and he's a Japanese fighter and he fights it like Japanese like other Japanese fighters, which let me go quickly look and shit like that, uh let's see, yeah, man, Shoki Sakai, let me see. Oh, like that's like, uh, where's he from? He's this dude's from Australia. I was about to say a white guy. But Joe Noine, Hiroto Hoshi, he fights a lot of, of Japanese fighters who have a good chin. So 19 wins with 17 knockouts, man. That's a man, and shit like that. As a Japanese fighter, that's pretty fucking good. And overall, Norman does have to watch out for that shit, and shit like that. Same for Jin Sakai, and shit like that, Same for Jin Sakai, because, I mean, you're going against a fucking monster with serious power, and shit like that, So, that's the thing and shit like that, Let me get this shit off the screen. Hold on, guys. So what these fighters need to do to win, I'm going to start off with the champion of Brian Norman Jr. So what Brian Norman Jr. needs to do to win is, stick to what he does. But the one thing that I do like to see with him and stuff like that, is where when he fought, like his last fight and shit like that, like against this one dude, it was like on Top Rank. Fuck, let me go look. Let me go look real quick, actually. Let me go look. So this is what these fighters need to do to winning this fight, and shit like that, is that, with Brian Norman, like, he utilizes, like, good defense and shit like that, but overall, like, with that, I do like to see him tighten up with the defense, but at the same time, for right now, with especially with this kind of fight, I would like to see him use kind of like what like his technique of what he did against Cuevas, where he utilizes, like, his aggression with his power, and shit like that, and he's just walking down, Sasaki. That's what I would like to see, and shit like that, Also see, like, defense and shit like that, whatever he works on with his defense. But I would like to see that more, just so, like, he could show people truly, like, more of his power, and shit like that. Because Sasaki's a very tough fighter, and shit like that, And with the win like this should really start putting him on the map, against tougher opposition, and stuff like that. So if he really looks impressive, that's gonna really put him on the map, and shit like that, So that's the thing and shit like that, So that's what I would like to see, like, from him and shit like that, is more of his aggression with his offense. Cause sometimes, like, he just lets his hands fly because he knows that he has power. But it's just he needs to know how to just get in there and shit, like how he did against Contreras. Not Contreras, but Cuevas, and shit like that, But that's the thing and shit like that, But yeah, man, and shit like that, that's what he got to do, and shit like that, and what he also got to do and shit like that, is he has to really be careful, and shit like that, because it's like he does have to utilize his footwork and his defense, because, I mean, like, you're gonna have to try to, like, cut the angles off of Sasaki. If he does that, and make Sasaki come forward, which that's what he's gonna usually do, probably, if he's gonna get cut off of range, or he's gonna just try to just go straight into the inside and shit like that, But, he gotta, kind of cut off the angles. He can't just fight straight up with Sasaki, because if he does that and shit like that, he's gonna, like, and I seen Norman get hurt, before, and people don't say this too. When the Cuevas fight, I swear I seen Brian, like, all the people that's watching this video and shit like that, like, literally, like, if you seen that shit too, and stuff like that, comment that you seen this shit too, like, and shit like that, if you want to comment or whatever. But Literally, like Norman got fucking like he got buzzed by Cuevas, man. Because he tried to fight straight on with Cuevas and shit like that. He needs to move his fucking feet, pick his moments when he's actually gonna want to swing like that and shit like that. Because Sasaki can swing anytime, any time of the day. And shit like that. With Norman's chin, it's a matter of time until like he needs to kind of readjust and make another game plan and shit, which he does very, very well at doing. But it just, like he got rocked a little bit by Cuevas, man, and it's just like, I remember that shit and I was like, damn, and shit like that, So he got to really be careful and be on his on 10 toes in this fight and shit like that, Even utilize defense, but not be too defensive, because if you're gonna be too defensive, Sasaki's gonna just keep on hitting you, and shit like that, And that's the thing, like. This is gonna be definitely a pretty tough fight for Brian Norman. Very tough fight. And shit like that. So you gotta utilize those tactics, utilize cutting off the angles, his footwork. Don't just fight straight on. And shit like that. Like he needs to, actually box, well and shit like that. Let his power get in there when it's time and shit like that, And that's the thing and shit like that, And that's what Brian Norman needs to do to winning this fight. But what Jin Sasaki needs to do and stuff like that, to winning this fight is that, Jin Sasaki needs to, stay active with his punching, and shit like that, But I do want to see him, tighten up, kind of like, with Brian Norman. I would like to see him tighten up more with his defense, because if he tightens up with his defense, makes it really hard, and then also utilizes his volume and shit like that with his punching, because overall, if both these fighters end up like doing really good and stuff like that, Sasaki's gonna be the person with the more punches and the more punches thrown, and shit like that, So it's like if he manages to do that and manages to do well with just throwing his punches, and shit, because overall he just really needs to fight his normal type of style, and shit like that, It's just like, he needs to, but it's just more of the important moments and shit like that, where, he can't get hit, like that, because he's getting hit a little too much. He needs to start tightening up on his defense, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, like, but, overall, like, like, utilize good defense, it's whatever and shit like that, because it's just more of like, no matter what, like, each fighter could slip a punch and then knock each other out, and shit like that. But, that's the thing and shit like that. These fighters can easily, go and, knock each other out and shit like that, So, but Sasaki just needs to, know that, he has the high volume and shit like that, and he just needs to know that also, at the same time, if he does really good, he's going to be the A-side fighter, because at the same time, he's the underdog overall. And overall, like, he's the B-side fighter in boxing, because, most people are probably picking Brian Norman in this fight. But, it's a tough fight. It's a very, very tough fight, and shit like that, So it's like, overall, he needs to know that and take advantage of that, and take advantage that, that the fight's in Japan, and shit like that, which I don't know why the fight's in Japan, and shit like that, like Brian Norman's the champion, so I mean, the fight should be in the United States, but he probably wants more money, and he probably just thinks the more money's over in Japan. I'm probably thinking, and stuff like that, because I mean, if you're from the United States, a lot of, like fighters from the United States, they like to fight in their own country, unless if it has to do with money, and stuff like that, and that's the thing and shit like that. Or if it was just in the contract, but it's just either way, like, I don't know why it would be in the contract because Sasaki is not a champion, like, like, but, Brian Norman is, but they probably really tried to make that fight happen, so it was probably like negotiations, and shit like that, or just more money And that's the thing. So yeah, that's what he just needs to utilize in the shit like that in this fight. Is his volume and just overall just everything that he knows and shit. Because overall, like, I know like Jin Sasaki might be like an unfamiliar name, but like, you know, like overall a Japanese fighter I'm never gonna underestimate because they're tough fighters, and second of all, and shit like that, like he's overall a pretty tough fighter, so this isn't gonna be a very easy fight, for Brian Norman and shit like that, so that's the thing and shit like that, but y'all. But right, but all right though. I said, all right, but all right though, and shit like that, But my final prediction for this fight and shit like that, like you guys know how I do it, I run it round by round, and shit like that, and that's how I'm gonna do it, and shit like that, But in the early rounds, I would probably say that, because they're both kind of like. I like they're both kind of slow starters, but like I didn't really see a lot of information from Sasaki in that part, and shit like that, but like off of how he fights, I mean, like, like it looked like I'm gonna just say that he does fight kind of like that. He's like that he is kind of a slow starter a little bit, and shit like that, But they're both kind of slow starters and shit like that, But I feel like that I'm probably gonna say Brian Norman's probably gonna win those rounds and shit like that. I feel like Sasaski's probably gonna win like a round, but I would probably give like the I would probably give like the early rounds, and shit like that to Brian Norman, But the mid rounds, and shit like that, ooh, let me think. So overall, I have Brian Norman winning the early rounds. I have it being a tie in the mid rounds, but then I have Brian Norman, like in a tough fight, but I have him winning the later rounds, and shit like that, But overall, I have the fight either 8 rounds to 4 or 7 rounds to 5 in favor of Brian Norman. Like I don't think he's gonna be able to stop Sasaki, because I mean, he can. I mean, obviously, he has the ability to do that. But I mean, and just in my prediction, I think it's going to go the distance in a really action packed fight, and shit like that, And overall, I do see this fight being close because overall, like, you know, let me go to the camera. Overall, like I would like to see, Brian Norman. Like I would like to see like Brian Norman like fix a couple of things and shit because he does get battered, and shit like that with punches. And if you want to fight people like Jaron Ennis, you're gonna need to know how to not always take those punches like that, because no matter what he's gonna like throw his punch in his, he's gonna look good for what he is, but overall, like he isn't gonna beat people like Jaron Ennis, and shit like that, and other people in that division. Like he has to tighten up on that, and shit like that, Overall, like I mean, still that's the thing. Like people could still like take that belt away from him and shit like that, And that's the thing. And overall, this is in Sasaski's backyard too, and shit like that, But that's the thing, and that adds on to that. He needs to fix, like his defense and shit like that, His offense is great. He knows how to fight very good with his offense, but he needs to tighten up with his defense, and shit like that, And that's the thing and shit like that, But I feel like, again, like things like that, like I said earlier in the video, that should wait because I feel like, like overall, like either way, like I don't see Sasaki, beating, Brian Norman. Brian Norman is a very crafty, smart fighter, and he'll still find his way to winning a fight, even if it has to go to the scorecards, and shit like that, And that's the thing and shit like that, So, you know, he got it, and shit like that, Brian Norman and shit like that. But if he fixes up his defense, I mean, like, he would be able to get this dude out of here, like, quick, and shit like that, But he, like his defense is still kind of lacking just a little bit, and shit like that, But yeah. But overall, I have Brian Norman winning this fight by a I would probably say, like, some like if it's that close, there's no way it's gonna be a unanimous decision. I'm probably gonna say a split decision. I got Brian Norman winning this fight by a split decision. And yeah, but thank you all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'm Preston. Peace out.